They say animals can feel the world before we do. Before the tremor splits the earth, the dog has long since bolted. Before the thunder shouts across the sky, the cat has vanished beneath the bed. It's not magic, or maybe it is. The kind of magic we've grown too loud to hear. When I was a child, my grandmother used to say that dogs could see ghosts. Not the kind that rattle chains or whisper boo, but the ones that follow us quietly cloaked in fear, in sadness, or in sickness. I didn't understand what she meant until much later. Until I met Ruby. There was always something different about Ruby. She wasn't remarkable to look at. No rare breed or striking coat. Just an ordinary shelter dog with ears too large for her head and eyes like rain clouds on a still lake. But the way she looked at you, it was like she knew something. Not about what you were doing, about what you were carrying. Before Ruby, I didn't believe in fate, or omens, or that the heart of an animal could tether itself to yours without a sound. But the story I'm about to share, Ruby's stories, the kind you don't forget it, began in spring. The kind of spring where everything bloomed too early and the air felt like borrowed time. My seizures weren't new by then. I'd been living with epilepsy for years, frustrating, chaotic years. They came like lightning, sudden, wild, unavoidable. I never remembered them. Only the aftermath, the aching muscles, the bloody lip, the worry in my mother's eyes. By the time I turned 17, I'd stopped going to school in person. Too risky, too unpredictable. I missed proms, exams, deaths, and weddings with equal measure. At some point, you stop telling people you're doing okay. Because lying is exhausting. And telling the truth feels like opening a floodgate no one asked to see. That's when Ruby came. My parents had gone to the shelter without me. Hadn't left the house in days, maybe weeks. They weren't looking for a miracle, just company. A heartbeat that didn't pity me. My mum said Ruby was the quietest dog in the shelter. Not shy, just watchful. She didn't bark once. Just walked right up and put her head against my father's leg. She came home that evening, smelling faintly of straw and cedar and something else I couldn't name, but came to recognize later as calm. The first time I saw her, she didn't leap or lick my face. She didn't wag her tail like most dogs do when meeting someone new. She just looked at me, tilted her head like she was trying to read a language I hadn't spoken yet. She followed me into the living room, sat exactly 2 feet away, close enough to reach me, but not enough to crowd me. When I lay on the couch, she stayed up all night. Under the coffee table, her eyes never closing. It was strange, comforting, unnerving. Over the next few days, Ruby didn't do much that would land her on a calendar or a pet food commercial. She wasn't playful or excitable. She didn't fetch or chew or bark at the mailman. She simply moved with silent purpose, following me from room to room, like I was the sun she'd chosen to orbit. And she watched. Her eyes never drifted far. When the microwave beeped, when a car passed by outside, when the wind trembled, the windows, Ruby kept watching me. At first, my parents thought she was just anxious. Shelter dogs sometimes are, but there was no restlessness in her, no panic. If anything, it felt as if she knew something we didn't. We didn't notice the signs at first, the pacing before it happened, the low, sorrowful whine as if she'd lost something precious seconds before I did. Once, I saw her stand perfectly still in the hallway, facing me with a look that nearly stopped my heart. She trembled not with fear, but anticipation, like she'd smelled smoke we couldn't smell. like she was bracing for the fire. A minute later, I collapsed. It wouldn't be the last time, as days turned into weeks, and weeks began to reveal a pattern I hadn't dared to hope for. A question took root in me. Not could she sense it, but how, at night, I would lie awake, watching her, watching me. And I remember whispering once, not expecting an answer, "What do you see, Ruby?" She didn't stir, just blinked slowly, like she was blinking away a storm that hadn't come yet. And that's when it started, not with sirens, not with warnings, but with the hush before the thunder, with a dog who, somehow, could feel the storm before the sky even knew it was coming. It's strange how a quiet presence can fill a whole house. Before Ruby, the days in our home moved like fog, slow, heavy, suspended in a kind of watchful waiting. My condition had pulled a hush over everyone. My parents talked in the soft voices of people afraid of jinxing something. I'd stopped trying to convince them, or anyone, that I was still just a girl and not a diagnosis. Truth was, some days even I forgot. We lived by the clock, in a way most people don't. Everything was scheduled: medicine alarms, rest time, meals timed around dosages. But no matter how carefully we built the routine, the seizures came when they wanted. My freedom, my teenage years, my sense of self, all faded into a blueprint of worst-case scenarios. They used to have dreams for me: college, travel, maybe art school. Those dreams gave way to shorter hopes: a week without injury, a normal meal, a full night's sleep for all of us. That was life before the day Ruby came home. It wasn't marked by anything grand. She didn't gallop down the hallway or leave pawprints on the furniture. She didn't claim the house with energy or kisses. She simply entered us, though she'd always belonged there, and everything began to shift. She was quiet, even her nails barely tapping the tile when she walked. My mum kept glancing at her like she was some kind of puzzle. "She hasn't barked once," she whispered. "Not once." I think she expected that to change. It didn't. I didn't say much the first night. I was tired. Tired in the way people get when they're endlessly watched but never truly seen. But Ruby didn't watch me like I was broken. She watched me like I mattered. She lay curled beside the couch, head on crossed paws, eyes following my every shift. Her patience was unnerving, almost reverent. When I reached out once, testing, her ear barely flicked before she met my hand halfway, warm, steady. I remember waking around 2 a.m., the house dark except for the hallway light, dim and yellow. Ruby was still awake. She hadn't moved. Still, beneath the table, watching me as though night meant nothing to her. As though someone had given her the job of keeping me herald. She was determined not to fail, my parents thought. Perhaps she had anxiety, or maybe she just hadn't adjusted yet. But I knew better. She wasn't anxious. She was waiting. Doesn't mean nothing is happening. The second day, Ruby followed me from room to room, always at a gentle distance. She didn't demand attention. She didn't attempt to play. When I coughed, she perked up. When I dropped a glass, she didn't flinch. But if I stood too still for too long, she'd come sit beside me, just close enough to remind me I wasn't alone. We didn't speak about it at first. How could you? What words do you even use to describe that kind of quiet tether? It wasn't until the end of the first week when we noticed something strange. My mother and I had been talking in the kitchen, a normal, easy conversation. Ruby had been laying near the fridge, half dozing, blinking slowly in the afternoon sun. Then she stood up, slowly, purposefully. She walked over to me and sat directly in front of my knees, pressed her body against my legs, and looked up. I laughed. "Hey Rue, what's up?" Then she let out a low, strange whimper knot, panicked, almost mournful. I remember the shift in the air, the way it suddenly felt harder to breathe, heavy, shimmering. 30 seconds later, I was on the floor. When I came to, Ruby was beneath me. Not beside, beneath. My head was resting against her side like a pillow. Her body bore the imprint of my foul, the way she had moved instantly to catch me. My mum was crying, not panic crying, not again crying. It was something else. Recognition. Maybe, or awe. We didn't say anything until later that night. At dinner, my dad brought it up softly. She moved before the seizure. My mum nodded. Before Emily felt anything, Ruby knew. None of us said the word coincidence. None of us wanted to speak it into the room like a spell that might undo whatever magic had started. From then on, we began watching her as closely as she watched me. And in the watching, we began seeing. 3 days later, it happened again. I was in my bedroom, door closed, reading. Ruby was asleep at my feet. She woke suddenly, stood up, and scratched at the door. By the time my mum had come upstairs, I was already on the floor after the 3rd time. We stopped pretending it might be random. There was something about her presence. Something that changed just seconds before I fell. A tension in her body. A fixedness in her stare. She didn't bark. She didn't panic. She warned. I started writing it down in a notebook, scribbled. Times and dates and what Ruby had done. Circling. Whining. Pressing herself against me like a sandbag holding back a flood. Once, in the hallway, I froze not from anything I felt. But because Ruby had stopped walking, she turned, fixed her eyes on mine, and let out one soft noise. Just once, I braced myself. 10 seconds later, my ears rang, my vision spun, and the ground kissed my cheek. She was under me again. She was always under me, and I started to wonder not just why she did it, but how. The day it stopped being coincidence was a Tuesday, one of those ordinary ones that slips by unnoticed. No storms, no doctor's appointments, no missed medications. The dog days of summer, sunlight thick on the kitchen floor. Emily had just begun. Putting butter on toast, her voice light as she told me about an old friend who'd reached out on social media. I was leaning on the counter, smiling. It was normal. One of those rare, golden moments when normalcy felt like it could stretch forever. And then Ruby lifted her head. She had been lying beneath the kitchen table, her eyes half-lidded in sleep, but suddenly her posture changed. She didn't stretch, or yawn like dogs usually do. She snapped alert, ears tall, eyes wide, watching not the room, not the door, watching Emily. She stood slowly. Her nails clicked softly against the tile. She stepped forward with deliberate steps, one paw after another, as if trying not to wake something already stirring in the air. Emily didn't notice at first. She was still talking, her back turned. Then Ruby let out a deep, low whine, the kind that vibrates, almost mournful. She circled once, then again, then sat directly behind Emily, her body rigid, her eyes fixed. I didn't even have time to call Emily's name. She dropped the toast, her shoulders stiffened, and then gone. She collapsed in the narrow space between the fridge and the kitchen table. Her knees gave out hard, uncontrolled. I heard the sharp breath tumble out of her lips just before her head tilted, dangerously toward the floor. But Ruby was quicker. She lunged, sliding herself beneath Emily as she fell. It was too fast to see, almost like instinct or muscle memory. But somehow Ruby caught her, not fully, not cleanly, but enough to soften the blow, enough to keep her skull from the tile. I remember the orange juice splattering on the counter, the horrible sound of her body hitting Ruby's instead of the ground, and then silence. That kind of silence that only comes after fear. I sat down next to them, careful not to disturb anything. Ruby didn't move, not even when Emily began to stir, not when I touched her back. She stayed in position, braced and steady, protective, present. When Emily came to, she was confused, of course, she always was. Afterward, her limbs trembled slightly. Her lips moved with half-formed words, and Ruby finally let out a second, softer noise, like she was saying, "It's okay now, I've got you." That was the moment we knew, not guessed, not suspected, knew not Ruby had given us a clear signaler, warning, a shield, and an embrace, all in one silent span of seconds. We didn't talk about it right then. Our hands were busy. Emily needed care, water, pillows, quiet. But when my husband came home later, I told him everything. My voice shook the way it does when you're telling someone the truth, but afraid it might vanish the moment it's said. Aloud, "She knew again," I whispered, before anything happened. He didn't question it this time. Neither of us did. After that day, we began documenting. I pulled an old notebook from a drawer, the kind with a leather cover and gilded edges from an office supply store. On the first page, I wrote the date in black ink. Ruby alert, 3 minutes before seizure onset. Circled, wind, pressed body against subject, subject. That was how I wrote it at first. It felt too surreal, too medical, but I couldn't bring myself to say Emily. Not yet. Not on paper. Over the days that followed, the entries continued. August 17th. Alert at 2:41 p.m. Ruby wind, followed subject to hallway, stood rigid. Seizure onset at 2:46. August 24th. Night alert. Scratched at Emily's door at 3:12 a.m. She woke up. Minor seizure began at 3:27. Ruby did not leave bedside. The timing was never exact, but always eerily close. Sometimes it was just 2 or 3 minutes. Other times, almost 20. But Ruby always knew. Not when it started, but long before. And it wasn't just reacting. She initiated. She moved first. Her body would tense like the ripple of wind before a gust. Her ears would flick in a way too subtle for anything mundane. But most of all, her gaze, her ever-watchful gaze would find Emily Ann fixed there. We began treating it like an early warning system. We couldn't stop the seizures, but we could prepare. Emily could lie down, wrap in blankets. We could notify her doctor. We could breathe, if only a little more. Sometimes I found myself watching Ruby more than I watched the clock. And I wasn't the only one. Emily began keeping her own log, not just of Ruby's behavior, but of how it made her feel. I found one of her notes torn out and left on her desk. It said, "It feels like having a lighthouse, like someone is scanning the waters, even when I can't see the rocks." We didn't understand how Ruby did it. She hadn't been trained for this. No specialist had molded her into a medical alert dog. She was just Ruby, a shelter dog with the eyes of something ancient and the patience of someone who had waited a long time to come home. But we stopped caring about the how. The mystery didn't matter as much as the meaning. She was helping, and Emily, she was beginning to hope again. Because sometimes healing doesn't start in a hospital. Sometimes it begins with a gaze, and a dog who decided that saving someone could be as simple as watching and waiting. The notebook changed everything. At first, it was just scribbles, unsteady handwriting in the margins of old to-do lists, receipts, grocery pads, any scrap my mother could find in the moment Ruby did something, unusual, a glance, a posture, a sound, something in her that shifted before something in me collapsed. But then the scraps started piling up. The patterns grew impossible to unseat. My dad bought a planner specifically for tracking Ruby's behavior. Thick pages, soft leather cover, hours and minutes etched into each line like we might finally trap time and reason between them. She began recording entries, like a scientist approaching a strange new element. 2:14 p.m., Ruby starts pacing in. Kitchen, no noises, no distractions, stares at Emily for extended time. 2:19 Emily reports dizziness. 2:21 seizure onset. The precision was comforting, predictable even. But it wasn't just numbers and times we were gathering. It was trust. A growing belief that maybe Ruby was showing us something essential, something true. And we only had to be still enough to learn her language. It wasn't long before we shared the notebook with Emily's neurologist. He was polite when we asked him to look at it. Polite in the way people are when they don't want to insult you but don't take you seriously either. He nodded in the right places, flipped the pages with professional thumbs, asked questions with a doctor's detachment. Has she been trained for any alert behavior? No, my mother replied. She wasn't trained for anything. She just started doing it. He was quiet for a moment, then glanced at Emily. His face softened. Well, maybe she's just remarkably attuned. Dogs can be intuitive. It was as close to agreement as we'd get. We knew it would take more than notebook scribbles. Something measurable, repeatable. So, together, we set up a series of informal tests. The first one was simple. Video cameras in the main areas of the house. Nothing secretive. We mentioned it to everyone, even rubbed, though I wasn't entirely sure she didn't understand. We logged everything. When she moved, when she stared, when she made noise, when she touched me, and we waited. The first confirmation came 3 days in. The footage showed Ruby sleeping on the carpet. I was reading aloud to my mum on the couch. At 3:11 p.m., Ruby's ear twitched. At 3:12, she stood up. At 3:14, she walked across the room and pressed her head against my knee. At 3:18, I fell sideways into her chest, like I'd rehearsed it somehow. The neurologist watched the footage twice in silence. That's very specific, he said slowly. That level of pre-ictal sensitivity is extremely rare. A week later, he brought a timer. We decided to chart how much time passed between Ruby's alert and the onset of a seizure. If she really was consistently warning us, how early was she sensing it? Over 10 episodes, in different locations of the house. The range varied, but never vanished. Sometimes she reacted 12 minutes before, sometimes 8, once 22. Not once was it accidental. Not once was she off. That's when we began calling it an alert. It felt too sacred, too earned to keep calling it anything else. She stopped being just our pet. She became our sentinel. My dad installed bells on the back doors so we could hear her movement from further away. For nighttime, because the seizures didn't wait for daylight, Ruby started sleeping in my room. The first time she pawed at my bed at 2:30 a.m., and I woke disoriented. groggy, wondering if she needed to go outside, only to find myself convulsing 5 minutes later. Ruby, hovering above me like a guardian eye, began to understand. She wasn't just reacting to something inside me. She was listening to something we didn't have the senses for. The unseeable shift. The shadow that rose before it had a shape. She felt it. How? That was the question that filled my dreams, filled the pages of our journals and our dinner conversations. Could it be smell? Seizures do affect the chemical composition of the body. Could my skin cells be whispering to her? Could my heartbeat change in some silent way, and she, who had lived for years practicing the symphony of Mead, just learned to hear it? We researched. My mum joined online epilepsy support groups, asked questions, connected with other families. Some had heard of seizure alert dogs, but almost all of them had gone through specialized training programs. None had found that awareness by accident or fate. Still, fate seemed to be the only explanation we trusted more than science. I started to believe she'd been waiting all along. That something in her, long before she knew me, had been preparing for me. We began building my life around her. Watching school became a possibility again. Not because the seizures were gone, they still came, but because I had time to lie down, to warn a teacher, to be heard. A kind of fragile independence grew in me, fed by trust. I could go to the grocery store, sit on a park bench, even ride my bike on good days, if Ruby came too. If she watched me. I remember the first time I felt that shift in her. Gaze and I turned to her before it began. I whispered, "Thank you." And later, when I felt the warmth of her under my head again, I realized something. She wasn't just protecting me from the fall. She was teaching me to listen before the silence broke. She was helping me see myself by showing me the storm before the sky knew it was coming. There are places in the world where nothing happens, and yet everything changes. Grass still grows. The sky still moves, slow and blue. Children ride bikes, and wind chimes clatter softly against eaves. But someone and something can still change. Everything that night. Emily wanted fresh air. It had been a good day. No seizures, no fatigue. Just a full breakfast, a small laugh at a TV show, and a real smile she hadn't worn in weeks. Around 6 p.m, she asked if she could walk through the neighborhood for a bit. Not far, just to feel the sky a little. We hesitated, like we always did, but Ruby stood by the door, tail still, waiting, watching. We nodded. Emily promised to text if she felt off. Promised she wouldn't go past the trail near the woods. Promised a dozen other things careful people say when they want their life to feel less fragile. She clipped Ruby's leash, laced her sneakers, and stepped through the screen door like it was just another Tuesday. The walk should have been 20 minutes, but 30 passed, then 40, and the phone didn't ring. I remember looking at the garden hose lying across the lawn, still looped from yesterday's watering. Something about it coiled, like waiting, made me uneasy. My husband said we should give her time, that maybe she was feeling strong, maybe even talking to a neighbor. That's when we heard the barking, not sharp or frantic, but steady, fast, rhythmic. It was Ruby's bark, but we'd never heard it that way before. It came from the direction of the trail. My husband and I ran. We found them at the far edge of the path. Just beside the pond, Emily was crumpled on the ground, half curled, face pale under the fading sky. Ruby stood over her, barking once every few seconds, never moving, never leaving her side, and beneath Emily's head, Ruby's body, she had positioned herself like a cushion, chest under Emily's neck, front leg angled behind her shoulder to brace against the slope. The details hit me all at once: Emily's cheek stroked by the grass, her hand still partly gripping the leash, the faint scrape on her temple that wasn't bleeding, but could have been much worse, and Ruby refusing to move, holding her steady. There were people nearby, joggers and cyclists, and had slowed, unsure what to do. It wasn't until one of them saw Ruby and looked twice that anyone stopped to help. A woman called out to us, pointing. "I think the dog's protecting her." She wasn't wrong. We knelt beside Emily, checked her breathing, felt for her pulse, regular if weak. Her eyelids fluttered. Her fingers twitched. She was coming back. Ruby let out a long exhale, just once, as if she too had been holding her breath. Emily woke gently. No startle, no terror. First her eyes blinked, then her lips parted slightly. "Rue," she whispered. "Ruby." Lowered her head and nuzzled her shoulder. She'd waited the whole time. The crowd had grown by then 5, maybe 6 strangers, keeping a respectful distance. As we lifted Emily slowly and got her to sit up, someone clapped quietly. Then someone else. It was awkward, soft, but deeply human. They weren't clapping for us. They were clapping for Ruby. There's a kind of reverence that exists when you witness goodness so instinctive. It feels divine. As we stood, Ruby trailing beside Emily like a shadow stitched in loyalty, I realized something. She wasn't just sensing seizures, she was saving Emily from the parts of life that didn't wait for anyone to save themselves. We went home in silence that felt hallowed. Not heavy, not scared, just quiet like a church after the candles have all gone out. That evening, the local community page lit up somehow. Someone had taken a photo: Ruby braced against Emily's fall, ears back, eyes forward, like a soldier. At her post, the caption read simply, "This dog just saved a girl's life." By morning, we had over 400 messages. People asked what kind of training she'd received. None, we said. They asked what breed she was. A shelter mix, we answered, mostly heart. Neighbors dropped by with dog bones, kind notes. A few even donated to epilepsy awareness foundations in Ruby's honor. The mailman left a drawing his daughter had made Ruby with a cape, standing beside a beaming girl with a lightning bolt on her shirt. When Emily saw it, she smiled faintly and said, "Ruby doesn't wear a cape. She wears my heartbeat." Sometimes, Emily spoke in poetry without trying to, and sometimes, truth sounds like a poem anyway. Ruby started sleeping even closer to Emily after that, not just near her, I mean close, spine to spine. As though even unconscious, she refused to give space to chance, and in the morning, Emily would whisper a soft thank you just before standing. That's the thing, isn't it? Some heroes don't have catchphrases, don't wait for applause. They just keep showing up, quietly, unfailingly, with a whimper, a circle, a stillness that commands the air around them, with eyes that know the weather hiding under your skin. One night, Emily asked me if I thought Ruby knew what she was doing, if she understands how much. I didn't know how to answer. So I told her what felt the most true. I think Ruby doesn't measure the worth of an action. I think she just listens. And when the storm inside you begins to rise, she moves. Not because she knows what to call it, but because she knows it matters. And that's enough. For the first time in years, Emily began to imagine the future, not days stitched together by caution tape, but real time. Time with color, with plans, with mornings that could hold more than hesitation. After the incident by the pond, word spread quickly. A local reporter had picked up the story from a community post. Then a regional blog asked for an interview. Emily was nervous, but said yes. Mostly because Ruby sat beside her during the phone call, tail occasionally thumping against the floor, like she was reminding everyone that she was there. The story moved further than we ever imagined. A non-profit organization for disability assistance dogs reached out. They'd seen the article and wanted to learn more about Ruby's abilities. One woman, a trainer with decades of experience, said she'd never seen an untrained dog exhibit such specific, consistent alerts. She's what's known as an innate responder, she explained. That's rare, very rare. She offered to evaluate Ruby officially for free. Emily and I drove an hour to a quiet training facility tucked behind farmland and pine trees. Ruby sat in the back seat, window down halfway, nose twitching every few seconds against the breeze. The evaluation wasn't a pass or fail test. It was a series of observations done over 2 days. Ruby was watched interacting with Emily in different contexts: rest, walks, reading, conversation, and periods of simulated stress. The trainer took notes quietly. She didn't speak much the first day, but at the end of the second, she knelt down, scratched Ruby's ears, and said, "She already knows her job. We'll just teach her how to wear the vests." Ruby began her official certification process shortly afterward. Emily, too. There were protocols for seizure alert dogs, even natural ones. The training helped polish what Ruby did instinctively: how to communicate more clearly during early signs, how to respond in public, how to alert others when Emily couldn't speak. Some of it, I think Ruby just humored us through. She'd already decided long ago who she wanted to be by the fall. Ruby was certified and registered. She received a cobalt blue vest with 3 Pachisa medical alert emblem, Emily's emergency instructions, and one that simply said, "I'm working." Emily wore a quieter smile those days, still cautious, always aware, but changed, not cured, not fear-free, but no longer defined by her fragility. She was becoming someone again. Her first day back at school, officially and in person, was a blur. I remember her standing in the kitchen, backpack slung over one shoulder, Ruby sitting perfectly beside her, the vest newly fastened. I wanted to cry, but didn't, not then. Instead, I kissed her forehead and said, "You got this." Ruby looked up at me like she agreed. Ruby walked every hallway with Emily, sat silently under desks, waited in line politely during lunch. A few students asked questions. One asked if Ruby knew tricks. Emily smiled and said, "She only knows one, but it saves my life." At night, Emily would fall asleep faster. Ruby would curl against the mattress just enough to touch, as if contact was the string that kept them tethered together, even in dreams. The word independence is overused sometimes, as if it means alone. But for Emily, independence came hand in paw. It meant doing things not alone, but finally with someone who understood, in quiet, in instinct, in breath, what it meant to be fragile and still determined. She began painting again, soft watercolors at first. One day, I found a canvas drying. On the windowsill, a pale blue sun rising above a girl with her eyes closed, and beside her, a dark-furred dog with stars painted into her eyes. I asked Emily what it was called. She said, "Waking up." She started driving again, too, under special regulation. She filled out the paperwork, passed the evaluations. Her doctor wrote the clearance letter, as long as Ruby went with her, and she'd pull over at the first sign of concern. Ruby sat in the passenger seat like a co-pilot, never restless, never distracted, focused. The radio played low, the windows open just enough. Small freedom, huge meaning. Our family life changed too. There was laughter again, dinner conversations that weren't just about doctor appointments or medication dosages. We had space to talk about things like books or the strange squirrel who'd taken up residence in our bird feeder. Ruby somehow made the silence safer, and in that safety, we lived more. One evening, maybe a year after Ruby's certification, Emily sat out on the porch swing with me. The sky was that gentle lavender that only belongs to spring. She said softly, "I know some days are still coming. Hard ones, bad ones, but I don't wake up scared anymore." Ruby was at her feet, already asleep. Emily looked down and gave a tiny smile. I think she taught me how to hope. And she had, because hope doesn't always arrive in triumph. In times, it pads into your life on soft paws. It sits beside you in your worst silence. It listens when your body fails you. It stares at the storm you, shaking, helpless, and it says, without words, "You're not alone. Not anymore." We always thought Ruby would age like she lived quietly, steadily, like a soft rhythm underneath the noise of our lives. But time doesn't tap you on the shoulder. It seeps in slowly. A few extra minutes of sleep in the mornings, a hesitation before jumping onto the couch. Then one day, you realize she doesn't jump at all. Her muzzle began to gray near her chin, first silver, waving through black like winter, creeping into the edges of autumn. Her eyes, still deep and knowing, became cloudy in the middle, like fog rolling over still water. She began to sleep more deeply, dream more often, sometimes stirring in her sleep with a faint yip, like she was chasing memory. Emily noticed first. She always did. "Do you think she's okay?" she asked one evening, lightly stroking behind Ruby's ear. "She's just getting older," I said. "Like all of us." But Ruby didn't get older like the rest of us. She got quieter. She watched, just as closely, but moved slower to act on it. Her alerts grew more delayed. Not wrong, just gentler in their timing. Once, she stirred only a minute before Emily's seizure. Enough, still, to give her time, but not like before. It scared Emily more than she let on. She started watching Ruby the way Ruby had watched her all those years, looking for tics, for tiredness, for signs in the silence. I caught her once, sitting with Ruby in the golden light of early evening, tracing the lines of her sleeping face with her eyes. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, like the ground had become so precious she couldn't bear to move. We all began adjusting. Where once Ruby had carried the quiet burden of anticipation, we now carried it for her. We padded our schedules, kept water bowls in every room, bought orthopedic beds, declined long walks and steep trails. Emily never left her side, not during storms, not during sleep. One night, around 3 a.m., I found her sitting on the floor of her bedroom beside Ruby's bed. Lights off, her hands softly pressed against Ruby's side, rising and falling with each breath. She slept through it. She whispered I knew what she meant. Earlier that evening, Emily had had a mild episode. No warning, no paw on her leg, no pressed body under her shoulders. Ruby had slept through it dreaming of something gentle, somewhere far from here. "It's okay," I said. "I know," Emily replied. "She's done enough." We both knew it. Ruby had already saved time for us that wasn't guaranteed. She had bought days, hours, seconds snatched from chaos. She had been tireless, and the body, no matter its devotion, can only carry so much. Ruby still tried, still offered her gaze like a soft anchor, still leaned her head into Emily's lap like she was saying, "I'm here." But even heroes age, even the eyes that once saw. The invisible grow dim with wear. During this time, Emily had begun college remotely, working toward her degree in neuroscience. She said she wanted to understand what Ruby had done and how. She took classes in cognitive biology, canine behavior, sensory perception. Her notebooks piled next to Ruby's bed. She taught me everything I care about, Emily said once as she highlighted a paragraph on olfactory signaling. Now I just want to know her language. Ruby would lay by her feet while she read, ears occasionally flicking in sleepy agreement. In between lectures and study, Emily volunteered at the local dog shelter, not to replace Ruben ever, but to give back what had been given so freely. She worked with dogs who trembled at loud sounds, who flinched at touch, who had forgotten what it was to be trusted. And somehow, her presence seemed to settle them, maybe because she'd been taught by the best. One morning, with coffee still warm in my hands, I watched her from the porch as she trained one of the shelter dogs in the yard. It was a yellow mix named Vera, who barked too much and jumped too high and didn't understand calm. But under Emily's patience, Vera started mirroring the stillness she'd seen in Ruby. Started watching first, waiting. "What are you teaching her?" I asked. Emily paused, thinking. "How to listen," she finally said. "How to stay, even when everything's moving." It made sense. Staying had always been Ruby's greatest strength. Still, we all felt it, that invisible shift. That whisper of final chapters beginning their slow arrival. Ruby's birthday came in spring, coinciding somehow poetically with the day she'd first entered our lives. We baked her a small cake made of peanut butter and banana. Emily wore a cone-shaped party hat beside her and sang softly under her breath. Ruby didn't eat much of the cake, but she wagged her tail once. That was enough, that night. After the sun had gone and the lanterns on the porch still flickered, Emily leaned her head against mine and exhaled. "I don't need her to warn me anymore," she said. "I mean, not always. I can kind of feel it coming now, like she taught my body, like I know it because she knew it." "She passed it on," I said. Emily nodded. "Yeah," she whispered. "She did. There are some lessons that don't come through sound or word, but through presence, repetition, belief. And in that presence, we carry pieces of those we've leaned on, their calm, their courage, their rhythm, and what Ruby had been. Emily was starting to become not quite a mirror of the past, but an answer to it. She passed on a morning that began like any other. The light came in soft that day, filtered through gauzy curtains in Emily's room. Ruby was lying in her usual spot, curled up tight against the base of the bed, her body no longer tense, no longer watchful, just still, in that sacred, wordless way that only dogs can be. Emily had woken early without knowing why. She said later she felt something in the air, like a cord that had stopped vibrating. She reached down and placed her hand on Ruby's side, expecting the rise and fall she'd known for years. Instead, she touched stillness. There was no panic, no cry, just one breath along, unshaking breaths. She leaned forward and laid her head beside Ruby's one last time. She whispered a thank you for every alert, Every fall softened. Every moment steadied. For all the storms she'd felt before they broke and made bearable, we wrapped Ruby in the green blanket she'd slept on since the early days, a blanket worn thin at the corners from years of loyalty. Emily tucked something into the folds with her, a drawing she'd made as a child of the two of them beneath a sky of scribbled stars. She should take that, she said quietly, in case she forgets where she belongs. We buried her beneath the oak tree in the backyard, not because it was the most practical place, but because it was the one spot where Ruby had always liked to sit in the afternoon light. Emily had once joked that Ruby could tell time by the way the shadows moved from that tree. Now, time would tell of her, not in clocks or calendars, but in the quiet, in the hush before thunder, in the moments Emily still raised her head instinctively, when she thought she felt a shift in pressure, only to remember Ruby was no longer watching, but somehow still with her. At first, the house felt hollow. Not silent, just less full. As though we'd removed something, integral, like a beam holding the weight of a roof you don't notice until it's missing. But grief didn't stay sharp. It softened into memory, into ritual, into something we could return to without breaking. Emily brought home a new dog nearly a year later, not to replace Ruby, nothing could, but maybe to begin something again. She named him Birch, a lanky mutt with clumsy feet and eyes far too bright to ever look serious. He didn't watch like Ruby had. Instead, he bounded and barked and dug up corners of the yard for reasons he never explained. He brought joy back in no premonitions, no warnings, just proximity and laughter. But sometimes, when Emily sat still too long, Birch would lay his head in her lap and blink slowly. And in those blinks, something familiar stirred. Maybe not instinct, maybe inheritance. By then, Emily had published her first paper on companion animal detection of neurological disorders. Her professors had read it with interest, but the part that mattered most was the dedication. For Ruby, it read, "Who knew long before we did." She began speaking at conferences, small ones at first, university panels, regional workshops, then larger ones, places where words like data and response latency didn't erase what she felt. She always carried one photo with her, Ruby mid-alert, her body arched beneath Emily's as she stretched to catch. Some audiences cried, others applauded, some simply sat very still. That kind of stillness that only comes when people finally understand something they'd never seen before. Sometimes, love arrives as a whisper, and sometimes it wears for pause and a heartbeat like a drum in the dark. The channel Pawprints and Whispers was the final gift Emily gave to the story. A space to archive experiences like hers, and to honor relationships like the one she'd lived. It wasn't always about medical alerts. Sometimes it was just stories of connection, listening, undeniable, quiet love. At the top of the website is a quote, "Some storms don't make a sound, but if you listen, sometimes you'll still hear a whisper, and sometimes it has 4 paws." That one was Emily's, but Ruby wrote it first. With every gaze, every stillness, every pawprint she placed, not in the earth, but on the hearts that followed her. We still see her, on occasion, in the way Birch lifts his head too fast at midnight, in the way Emily presses her palm quietly against her ribs when something inside her shifts, in the way the wind rustles that oak tree just once, just enough, like someone brushing past, unseen. She was never trained, never taught. She didn't wear capes or carry certificates when she started, but she found Emily And she stayed, through seizures and sorrow and days lost to shadow. And in that staying, she gave not just protection, but purpose. So this isn't a goodbye, not really, because Ruby never left. She just stepped gently inward into the pulse we carry when we remember who stood beside us when it mattered most. Sometimes, after the storm has passed and the ground dries, if you know where to look, you can still find them, paw prints and whispers.